Empire of Blood. Episode 6. A civilization must be built on bones. Benito Mussolini, the fascist Italian Empire, 1922 to 1945. A production of Empire of Blood. The sound arrives before the soldiers do. Hirut hears it the way you hear distant thunder, as a vibration more than a noise, something felt through the soles of bare feet on packed earth before it registers as sound at all. She is 17 years old, and she is standing at the edge of her family's compound in a village in the Tigray highlands, and the sound that is coming up from the valley below is not thunder. It is engines. It is the particular mechanical groan of Italian military trucks grinding up the dirt road that has served this region for trade and seasonal movement for as long as anyone can remember, now carrying something that has no precedent in the life of this village or in anything she has been told to prepare for. The village has known war. Ethiopia has always known war, has always existed in the awareness of contested borders and raiding parties and the periodic ambitions of neighbors. But war of that kind has a human scale. It arrives on foot or on horseback. It smells like men and animals. It makes a noise you can read, the sound of a crowd, of drums, of voices carrying commands. What is coming up this road now is different in kind, not just in degree, and the difference is audible before any truck crests the ridge. The elders called a meeting 3 days ago. There had been rumors since the spring, ever since the Italian military build-up at the border began to take on a character that the merchants and the travelers and the priests who moved between communities could no longer explain as routine. There had been emissaries from Addis Ababa, from the government of Emperor Haile Selassie, carrying a general mobilization order that had the quality of something being done for the first time and therefore done without confidence that it would work. The men of the village had taken down their weapons. Rifles, mostly, some of them old enough to have been used in the last Italian war, at Adwa in 1896, when Ethiopia defeated an Italian invasion and became the only African nation to successfully repel a European colonial army, a fact that the elders invoked with a particular pride of people whose identity is organized around it. Hirut's father sharpened a blade. Her mother packed grain into clay pots and buried them in the floor of the cooking room, a precaution against the possibility of a return to retrieve something after a departure. Her brother, who was 22, cleaned a rifle that had not been fired in years. Nobody said to her directly that something terrible was coming. Nobody needed to. On the morning of October 3rd, 1935, the Italian army crosses the Mareb River into Ethiopian territory. Not with a battalion or brigade. With an army, 100,000 men in the first wave, with tanks and artillery and aircraft and the chemical weapons that no one in this village has a word for, yet the yellow-brown clouds that will begin to descend on Ethiopian positions from the air in the months ahead. In Rome, 3,000 miles away, Benito Mussolini stands on the balcony of the Palazzo Venezia and addresses a crowd of hundreds of thousands of Italians and tells them that Italy has been patient, that the hour has come, that the world will witness what Italian arms can accomplish. The crowd cheers with the specific frenzy of people who have been told for 13 years that their nation's greatness has been withheld from them and is finally about to be restored. Hirut does not hear this speech. She hears the engines. The first trucks appear at the top of the ridge in the early afternoon. They are followed by others and by infantry marching alongside the trucks, and by the particular quality of organized movement that large military forces project, the sense of something that has a direction and a momentum and that cannot be redirected by anything in its path. The soldiers are wearing khaki uniforms with pith helmets, equipped with rifles and machine guns and accompanied by officers on horseback, who carry an air of authority that seems unaware that it is in a place where it has not been invited. There are Ethiopian fighters in the hills above the village. Hirut knows this because she has seen some of them pass through in the days before, men from neighboring villages moving into the high ground with their weapons, part of the resistance that will fight the Italian advance, with the same kind of disciplined courage that had worked at Adwa 40 years earlier. What will become devastatingly clear in the weeks and months ahead is that what worked at Adwa will not work against this. The courage is the same. What has changed is the technology on the other side, and the willingness to use it against civilians. The soldiers enter the village at dusk. They move through the compounds with the efficiency of men following a procedure rather than men making decisions. Searching buildings, taking food stores, checking faces against the particular calculus of military suspicion that cannot articulate its criteria, but applies them anyway. An officer speaks in Italian, and then in a broken phrase of Tigrinya, the local language, that has clearly been taught to him for this purpose. The phrase is something about order, something about cooperation, something about how things will be better now. Hirut watches from the doorway of her family's house. She watches an Italian soldier pick up a clay water jug that her mother made, examine it, and set it down. She watches another soldier take a bag of grain from the storage room, watched by her mother, who says nothing because there is nothing to say, because the soldier is one of many and the soldiers have guns. She watches her brother's face while all of this is happening, the particular stillness of a young man containing an impulse that the presence of the rifles on all sides is making untenable. Her father is not there. He has gone to join the fighters in the hills. She does not know, standing in that doorway on October 3rd, 1935, that the war she is watching arrive in her village will involve Italian aircraft spraying mustard gas over Ethiopian columns and civilian populations, that it will involve the systematic bombing of Red Cross stations despite the clear Geneva Convention markings on the tents, that it will involve the massacre of monks and pilgrims at the monastery of Debre Libanos in 1937, that it will involve concentration camps in Libya for the Senussi population, that it will involve a deliberate policy of terror against any Ethiopian population suspected of harboring resistance fighters. She does not know that the man whose orders have sent these soldiers to her village understands perfectly well what his army is capable of, and has specifically authorized the use of chemical weapons after the Ethiopian resistance proves more effective than the initial campaign expected. She does not know any of this. She knows the sound of the engines. She knows the weight of the soldier's hand when it moves her aside in the doorway to look into the room behind her. She knows that her mother's face has taken on the quality of a person who is concentrating on not showing what she is actually feeling. She knows that her world has been entered by something that does not care what that world is. Somewhere in Rome, Benito Mussolini is being photographed for tomorrow's newspapers. He is smiling. The village does not have a name in the newspaper dispatches that will report the fall of Addis Ababa in May 1936. Villages like Hirut's never have names in newspaper dispatches. They have locations, coordinates on military maps, positions on supply routes, markers on the administrative maps that colonial governments draw of territories they have decided to administer. The people in them are demographic data, or potential laborers, or resistance sympathizers to be watched, or in the most extreme applications of colonial logic, threats to be eliminated. The gap between how the village appears in the Italian military records, as a point on a route, a source of intelligence, a potential site of resistance, and how it appears to Hirut as home, as the accumulation of every particular thing she knows and loves and relies on, is the gap between empire and life. It is the gap that this story is about. The empire in the dispatches and the speeches and the balcony photographs is not the same thing as the empire on the ground. At the level of a 17-year-old girl in a doorway, and the one that matters for the accounting of history is not the one in the speeches. What the village is before the soldiers arrive is worth specifying because specificity is the opposite of the generalizing abstraction through which colonial violence erases the people it targets. The highland region of Tigray, where this village sits, is one of the oldest continuously inhabited regions in the world. The terraced fields that Hirut has grown up working, the particular quality of the morning light at altitude, the ancient churches carved into the cliff sides of the Geralta Mountains that the priests maintain with the continuity of a tradition that predates the Italian state by 1,000 years. All of this is not backdrop. It is a civilization with its own history, its own literature, its own artistic tradition, its own understanding of what a good life is and what a community owes to its members. The Italian colonizers who will arrive in Hirut's village in October 1935 have been told, through the official apparatus of fascist propaganda, that they are bringing civilization to a place that does not have it. This requires a specific and deliberately maintained ignorance of what is actually there, an ignorance that is not accidental but structural, built into the education system that has produced the soldiers, the ideology that frames the mission, the language of the official documents that describe what is being done. The soldier who steps over Hirut's threshold is, in his own understanding of himself, not committing an act of violence. He is participating in a historic mission. He has been told this, and he believes it, and the belief makes the act possible in a way that requires the specific kind of moral blindness that ideology produces in otherwise ordinary people. The capacity to see the person in the doorway as an abstraction, native, African, subject of the new empire, rather than as a specific 17-year-old girl with specific parents in a specific relationship to the specific threshold she is standing in. This is how ordinary violence is committed at scale. Not by people who know what they are doing and do it anyway. Not primarily, though those people also exist in this story. Primarily by people who have been given a framework within which what they are doing is not violence but mission, not theft but administration, not murder but pacification. Hirut's threshold is where that framework meets its refutation. She is a specific person. She knows exactly what is happening, and she does not forget. Italy in 1935 is a country that has been told for 13 years that it is on the verge of becoming great again. The telling is specific and relentless and expertly performed by a man who understands with an intuitive precision that no amount of formal political training could have produced how to give a people the story they most desperately want to hear. The story that Mussolini has been telling since the March on Rome in 1922 is the story of a nation that was cheated at Versailles, cheated by its so-called allies, cheated of the territorial rewards that 1 million Italian dead in the First World War should have purchased, and that is now, under his leadership, reclaiming what was always rightfully its own. Italy is the heir of Rome. The Mediterranean is Mare Nostrum, our sea. Africa and the ambitions of empire that it represents are not colonial exploitation, but civilizing mission, the restoration of Roman order to lands that Roman feet once walked. This is what the newspapers say. This is what the cinema newsreels show. This is what the school books teach and what the party rallies perform and what the radio broadcasts from every village square in the country. It is a story so carefully constructed, so relentlessly maintained, so backed by the apparatus of a state that has systematically eliminated every competing narrative, that by 1935 a significant proportion of the Italian population believes it with a conviction that is genuinely felt and not simply performed. Let us understand where that story comes from and why it finds such a ready audience. Italy is a young country in 1922 when Mussolini takes power, unified only since 1861, cobbled together from the diverse states and territories of the peninsula by a risorgimento movement whose idealism exceeded its institutional competence. The unified state that emerges from that movement inherits a set of problems that the mere fact of unification does not solve. A profound north-south economic divide that separates the industrializing north from the agricultural, impoverished south. A political class whose competence and legitimacy are both questionable. A Catholic Church that regards the new secular state with active hostility, and a newly literate working class that is discovering, through socialism and anarchism and the growing trade union movement, that the promises of the Risorgimento, freedom, dignity, prosperity, have not been delivered to the people who were supposed to benefit from them. The First World War makes all of this worse. Italy enters the war in 1915 on the Allied side, having been promised in the secret Treaty of London that a victorious outcome will deliver territorial rewards in the Adriatic, in Africa, and in Asia Minor. When the Versailles settlement arrives in 1919, the rewards are substantially less than promised. Britain and France have their own territorial priorities. The new American principle of national self-determination complicates the carving up of the former empire. Italy receives some of what it was promised and not the rest, and the political class's inability to extract the full promised territory from the Versailles negotiations becomes, in Italian political culture, the mutilated victory. The mutilated victory, the sense that Italy had paid the price of a great power war and been treated as a minor one. The mutilated victory is politically real, even if its factual premises are partially exaggerated. The resentment it generates is real. The sense of national humiliation that it produces, the sense of being overlooked, dismissed, condescended to by the older imperial powers, feeds the nationalist movements that will eventually bring Mussolini to power, and it feeds them because it corresponds to something that a significant portion of the Italian population feels not as propaganda, but as lived experience. Meanwhile, the social conflicts that the war has intensified are producing what the Italian political class calls the Red Years, the Biennio Rosso of 1919 and 1920. 2 years of massive strikes, factory occupations, land seizures, and general social upheaval in which the existing political order seems genuinely unable to maintain control. The industrialists are frightened. The landowners of the North Italian plain are frightened. The middle class, the shopkeepers and the small businessmen and the professional men who fought the war and came home to find the socialist movement threatening to overturn the social order, is frightened. Into this specific combination of nationalist resentment and class fear steps Benito Mussolini, with the Fasci di Combattimento, the combat leagues, organized from 1919 around a program that deliberately combines nationalist glory with anti-socialist violence. The squadrismo, the black shirt squads, are his instrument, organized gangs of ex-soldiers and nationalist youth who attack trade union offices, socialist newspapers, cooperative buildings, the organizational infrastructure of the left. The attacks are conducted openly, often in coordination with local police and military commanders who regard the black shirts as useful allies against the more dangerous threat of socialist revolution. The violence works. The socialist movement, which had seemed unstoppable in 1920, is broken by 1922. The trade unions are intimidated. The cooperative movement is dismantled. The political parties that might have organized effective resistance either cannot agree on a strategy or are too frightened to contest the black shirt violence directly. And Mussolini, who has been cultivating the image of a strong man who can impose order on a country that seems to be losing it, receives the invitation he has been positioning himself for. In October 1922, the fascist movement organizes the March on Rome, a theatrical mobilization of black shirt squads toward the capital that is less a genuine coup and more a well-staged demonstration of political will backed by the threat of force. King Victor Emmanuel III, who has the constitutional authority to order the army to disperse the march and the military capacity to do so, chooses not to. He invites Mussolini to form a government instead. Mussolini arrives in Rome by train, having spent the march itself in Milan, and is appointed Prime Minister on October 29, 1922. He is 39 years old. He has arrived at the apex of Italian political power through a combination of tactical violence, theatrical spectacle, and the failures of the institutions that should have stopped him. He is not, at this moment, yet the dictator he will become. He is a prime minister who leads a coalition government and who must manage the political factions of a parliamentary system he does not yet control. It will take him 3 more years to consolidate absolute power, and the path from coalition prime minister to unchallenged dictator runs directly through the crisis that reveals, for anyone willing to look, exactly what kind of man Mussolini actually is. The Matteotti crisis is that revelation. Giacomo Matteotti is the General Secretary of the Italian Socialist Party, a member of Parliament, a lawyer, a careful and courageous man who has been documenting the electoral fraud and black shirt violence of the April 1924 elections with the meticulous attention of someone who believes that evidence, properly presented, can still change things in a democracy that is not yet fully dead. On June 10, 1924, he is kidnapped from the street in front of his home in Rome by a group of Mussolini's secret operatives. His body is found in a field outside Rome 2 months later. He has been stabbed repeatedly. The murder produces a political crisis that, for a few weeks, seems as if it might destroy the Mussolini government. The opposition parties withdraw from parliament in protest. The international press is outraged. Within Italy, even some fascist supporters are shaken by the brazenness of what has been done. There is a moment. Historians have debated its extent and its seriousness. But the moment is real. When the Italian establishment, the king, the military, the industrialists, the church, could have decided that Mussolini had gone too far and moved against him. They do not move. On January 3, 1925, Mussolini addresses the Chamber of Deputies and dares them to hold him responsible for Matteotti's murder. He is not confessing. He is asserting. He is telling the Italian Parliament and the Italian establishment that he knows they will not act, that the crisis has revealed not his vulnerability but theirs, and that he intends to use what remains of their paralysis to complete the consolidation of power he has been building toward since 1922. He introduces a series of laws in the following months that abolish press freedom, ban opposition parties, dissolve independent trade unions, and establish the political police force, the OVRA, that will surveil and suppress dissent for the next 2 decades. He becomes, formally, Il Duce, the leader. This transformation is possible not because the Italian people are uniquely susceptible to fascism or uniquely incapable of resisting it, but because the specific combination of circumstances, the mutilated victory, the red years, the failure of parliamentary institutions, the complicity of the establishment, the violence of the squadrismo, created a political moment that Mussolini read with extraordinary accuracy and exploited with extraordinary skill. And now he needs a project. He needs the thing that will give the fascist state its claim to historical greatness, the thing that will validate the myth of national rebirth in the concrete terms of territorial expansion and imperial power. Because the story he has been telling since 1919, the story of Italy as the heir of Rome, as the future master of the Mediterranean, as the civilizing force that Africa and the East require, is a story that eventually requires proof. Ethiopia is the proof. Ethiopia has been, in Italian nationalist imagination, an open wound since 1896 and the defeat at Adwa, the only European power to be defeated by an African army in a major battle, the humiliation that hangs over Italian colonial ambitions like a debt that has never been paid. And Ethiopia is an independent African nation, one of only two on the continent, along with Liberia, whose existence represents a standing refutation of the claim that European civilization has the right and the duty to bring order to Africa. Mussolini does not decide to invade Ethiopia spontaneously. He builds toward it through years of preparation and provocation, through the Walwal incident of December 1934, a clash at a disputed border post that the Italian side engineers into a pretext for escalation, and through the conviction, correctly assessed, that Britain and France will not seriously oppose the invasion because they need Italian cooperation in Europe against the growing German threat. He is right about this. The Hoare-Laval Pact of December 1935, a secret agreement between the British and the French foreign ministers to offer Mussolini large portions of Ethiopian territory in exchange for stopping the war, is one of the most cynical diplomatic documents of the 20th century, and its revelation to the public causes a scandal that brings down both foreign ministers. But its existence tells you what the great powers actually calculate about Ethiopia's survival. The calculation is wrong in the sense that it does not stop the war, but it is accurate in the sense that the international community will not effectively intervene. The League of Nations imposes sanctions on Italy, but the sanctions exclude oil, the commodity that Italian military operations most require, because Britain and France cannot agree on including it, and by the time the debate is resolved, it is too late to matter. The war lasts 7 months. The Ethiopian army fights with extraordinary courage and considerable tactical skill, and in the early months holds its own against the Italian advance. The turning point is not Italian military superiority on the ground. It is the decision, made in Rome and executed by Marshal Badoglio and the commanders in the field, to use chemical weapons against both Ethiopian military formations and civilian populations. This is what Hirut sees coming up the valley road. This is what Mussolini's empire actually looks like, at the distance of a single dirt road in the Tigray highlands. And when the newspapers in Rome are done reporting the victory, when the photographs of the Duke of Aosta entering Addis Ababa have been printed and the speeches about Rome reborn have been delivered, the empire will still be here. In this village, in the compounds where food has been taken and men have been killed, and a 17-year-old girl is learning what the words conquest and civilization actually mean when they are not being used in a speech. The propaganda apparatus that Mussolini builds is, by the standards of the 1920s and 1930s, the most sophisticated of its kind in the world. This is not a compliment. It is an observation about a specific kind of technical achievement, the systematic construction of a symbolic universe within which the regime's narrative is so thoroughly embedded in the texture of everyday life that questioning it becomes, for most people, psychologically difficult rather than merely socially dangerous. The regime controls the press from 1925 through a combination of legislation and violence. Newspapers that continue to publish oppositional content are shut down, their editors arrested or expelled or simply intimidated out of the profession. What remains is a press that is not uniformly enthusiastic. There are gradations within permitted discourse, subtle distinctions between the true believers and the accommodationists and the people who have decided that publishing what is permitted is preferable to not publishing at all, but that operates within a framework that cannot produce serious challenge to the regime's foundational claims. The cinema is managed through the Istituto Luz, which produces the newsreels shown before every film screening in the country. Obligatory viewing in a society where cinema attendance is, in the 1930s, the primary form of mass entertainment for a population that is becoming more literate but has not yet fully made the transition to print. The newsreels present the regime's activities in the mode of celebration, the great building projects, the drainage of the Pontine marshes, the construction of roads, the discipline of the youth organizations, the heroic advance of the Italian army in Africa. They show Mussolini in all his physical performances, riding horses, piloting aircraft, threshing grain alongside peasants in the fields, and the effect is cumulative and immersive in the way that the cinema always is. You sit in the dark and receive the images as reality, without the critical apparatus that reading might allow. The radio extends the propaganda reach to the rural population that cinema cannot fully penetrate. The installation of loudspeakers in village squares is a deliberate policy, creating the possibility of the Duce's voice reaching even the most isolated communities. The voice that comes out of those loudspeakers is remarkable in a specific technical sense. Mussolini is one of the great orators of the 20th century, if oratory is understood as the capacity to produce emotional response in a mass audience through sound rather than through argument. His speeches work physiologically. The rhythms, the pauses, the crescendos, the call and response with crowds that he has refined through 15 years of practice on platforms of increasing scale. They are performances, and they are performances of extraordinary skill. The content of the performances, examined in isolation from the delivery, is often banal, circular, or simply false. The ideology of fascism, when you strip away the theatrical presentation, does not have the intellectual architecture of Marxism or even of classical conservatism. It is a collection of emotional claims. Italy is great. Italy has been cheated. Italy will be great again. The enemies are known. The leader is here, backed by the threat of violence rather than the force of argument. But the delivery converts banality into experience. You are not reading the argument. You are in the room when the voice rises, and the effect is immediate and physical in a way that critical reading is not. The youth organizations, the Opera Nazionale Balilla for children and the Gioventù Italiana del Littorio for adolescents, are the vector through which the next generation is formed within the regime's symbolic universe. By the early 1930s, membership is effectively compulsory for school-aged children, and the organizations provide the social world within which young Italians grow up. The sports, the summer camps, the uniforms, the ceremonies, the marching and singing, and the explicit cultivation of the martial virtues that the regime values. Children who are in the Balilla from the age of 6, who wear the uniform and sing the songs and participate in the ceremonies through their entire adolescence, are not simply receiving propaganda. They are being shaped at the level of identity. They are learning who they are within a framework that has been designed to make the fascist state feel like the natural expression of their own deepest commitments. This works. Not on everyone, and not permanently, and not without the coercive backstop of the OVRA and the Squadrismo that ensure compliance from those who are not persuaded. But it works sufficiently, on enough people for long enough, to make the claim that Italian fascism was simply imposed on an unwilling population false in the ways that matter for historical accountability. The economic dimension of the regime's popular support is also real and needs to be understood, because it provides the material basis for the ideological claims. The fascist state does construct infrastructure, the autostrade, the drained marshes, the expanded railway system, the public work projects that employ hundreds of thousands during the Depression years when unemployment is a genuine catastrophe across the developed world. These projects are real, however they are represented in the propaganda, and they provide the economic substance that makes the propaganda credible to people who might otherwise be skeptical of the rhetoric alone. The Italian economy of the 1930s is not prosperous. The Depression hits Italy as it hits every industrial country, and the autarkic economic policies that Mussolini adopts in response are not economically rational. But it is functioning at a level that provides the population with enough stability to make the comparison with the chaos of 1919 to 1922 feel favorable. The trains, as the cliché has it, run on time. This matters to people whose experience of the pre-fascist state was of a government that seemed unable to manage the basic functions of public order. The empire is supposed to complete this story. The economic argument for the Ethiopian conquest, land for settlement, resources for industrial expansion, the solution to Italy's overpopulation problem through colonial immigration, is as real a part of the ideology as the Roman glory mythology, and it speaks to the material anxieties of a population that has been told for decades that Italy's poverty relative to the Northern European powers is not the result of structural economic factors, but of the deliberate withholding by those powers of what Italy is owed. Ethiopia, in this framework, is not a country with its own civilization and its own right to self-determination. It is the missing piece of Italy's legitimate inheritance. This is what makes the propaganda so effective and so dangerous. It takes real grievances, the genuine economic deprivation of large portions of the Italian population, the genuine humiliation of the Versailles settlement, the genuine failures of the liberal state, and converts them into a narrative that makes violence feel like justice. The people in Hirut's village pay the price of this conversion. Benito Amilcare Andrea Mussolini is born on July 29, 1883, in the village of Predapio in the Romagna region of northern Italy, and the name his father gives him is itself a declaration of intent. Benito, after Benito Juarez, the Mexican revolutionary president; Amilcare, after Amilcare Cipriani, an Italian socialist and revolutionary; Andrea, after Andrea Costa, a founder of the Italian socialist movement. He is named for revolutionaries by a revolutionary, and the world he is born into is the world that is making revolutionaries. His father, Alessandro Mussolini, is a blacksmith and a passionate socialist, a man of the specific kind of rural Italian radicalism that combines genuine economic grievance with an autodidact's love of political theory and an atheist's contempt for the church that tells the poor to be patient with their poverty. Alessandro reads Marx and Bakunin and Kropotkin in the evenings after the forge has cooled. He talks politics in the osteria, the local tavern, with the other men of the village, and he has the particular quality of the self-educated man of strong convictions. A man whose certainties are all the more intense for having been arrived at through effort rather than inheritance. His mother, Rosa, is a school teacher, devout where her husband is atheist, orderly where he is passionate, the stabilizing force in a household organized around Alessandro's enthusiasms and resentments. She is the one who ensures that Benito goes to school, that there is food on the table on the days when Alessandro has been more revolutionary than productive at the forge, that the household functions despite the competing pressures of the ideology and the poverty in the 3 children. Benito is the oldest. The village of Predapio is in the Romagna, which in the late 19th century has a specific political culture, socialist and anti-clerical, with a tradition of popular radicalism that dates to the revolutionary upheavals of 1848, and that shapes the landscape as surely as the Apennine hills that surround it. The Romagna is the place where Garibaldi recruited, where the anarchist and socialist movements have their strongest rural base, where a blacksmith radical like Alessandro Mussolini is a representative figure rather than an eccentric. The boy who grows up in this environment absorbs its politics the way children absorb everything, not as a set of propositions to be evaluated, but as the texture of reality, the given background against which all other experience is measured. He is intelligent, clearly, with the particular intelligence of a child whose parents take ideas seriously, and who learns early that books and argument and the manipulation of language are paths to status and influence in the world his family inhabits. He reads voraciously and unsystematically, with the self-educated person's combination of genuine absorption and imperfect critical apparatus, taking in Marx and Nietzsche and Sorel, and mixing them in a way that a more formally trained mind might find incoherent, but that produces, in him, a powerful and flexible set of ideological tools. He is also, from early in his life, a bully. This is documented with enough consistency across sources that it cannot be dismissed as retrospective characterization. He is aggressive with other children, prone to physical violence in disputes, and already, in his school years, marked by the combination of intellectual pretension and physical intimidation that will characterize his political persona for the rest of his life. He's expelled from school for stabbing a fellow student with a penknife. Not figuratively, an actual penknife, resulting in an actual wound, resulting in actual expulsion. He repeats this pattern at a second school. These episodes are not simply anecdotes about a difficult child. They reveal something about the structure of his personality that the subsequent decades will confirm and amplify. A man who uses force not as a last resort after other means have failed, but as a primary form of communication, a way of establishing the hierarchy of his relationships with other people. He's the kind of person who, when he encounters resistance, reaches for the tool that makes resistance uncomfortable. First the penknife, later the squad. He becomes a teacher, briefly, in a village school in the Trentino region, then in Austria, Hungary's Italian-speaking territory. He's a poor teacher in the conventional sense, impatient, aggressive, not able to maintain the kind of consistent authority that classroom management requires. But he is already practicing the skills that will matter later. Public speaking, the management of a room's attention, the projection of personality into a space. He is practicing becoming the kind of man who, when he speaks, makes other people feel that something important is happening. He discovers that he can do this. It is the most important discovery of his early life. He moves into journalism and political organizing in the years before the First World War, building a reputation in the Italian socialist movement as an editor and agitator of genuine talent. Someone whose prose has energy and whose speeches have force. Someone who can take an ideological position and make it feel urgent and necessary and right. He edits the socialist newspaper, Avanti, from 1912, and his editorship is marked by a combative, provocative style that builds the paper's readership and his own reputation simultaneously. Then comes 1914, and the war and the Great Rupture. The Italian Socialist Party, following the International Socialist position, opposes Italian entry into the First World War. Mussolini, initially, takes this position, then he reverses. He begins to argue in the pages of Avanti And then in a new newspaper he founds with funding from French intelligence sources and Italian industrial interests that Italy must enter the war. He frames the position in socialist terms at first, the war as a revolutionary opportunity. And then, as the socialist framework becomes increasingly uncomfortable with his actual politics, he abandons it and moves to a nationalism that absorbs everything useful from his socialist formation, while jettisoning the class analysis that had given it its critical edge. The shift is ideological, but it is also psychological. Mussolini is not simply a man who changes his mind on the war question. He is a man who discovers, in the process of making the argument for intervention, that the emotional register of nationalism, the pride, the glory, the claim of historical destiny, the use against them structure, is more congenial to his actual psychological needs than the internationalist solidarity of socialism. Socialism requires a belief in the fundamental equality of human beings across national lines. Mussolini does not, in the depth of his character, actually believe this. Nationalism tells him that what matters is power, hierarchy, the victory of one group over another. This is the world as he actually experiences it. He serves in the war, is wounded by a mortar accident during a training exercise in 1917, and returns to Milan with a wound that he will describe in the years ahead in increasingly heroic terms. The actual wound, a relatively serious but not unusual training accident, will be converted in the telling into the wound of a frontline hero, the physical mark of a man who put his body in service of the nation's cause. This conversion of ordinary biography into heroic mythology is something Mussolini will practice on himself throughout his career, and it reveals a second key feature of his psychology that the penknife and the violence have already introduced. He is a man who understands that the story told about power is as important as the power itself, and who has a natural, almost instinctive talent for shaping the story. He does not stumble into self-mythologization. He practices it deliberately, carefully, with the attention of a craftsman who knows that the product he is making will be inspected closely. The fascist movement that he builds from 1919 is, in its early form, programmatically incoherent and politically opportunistic in ways that even contemporary observers note with some bemusement. The Fasci di Combattimento's initial program in 1919 includes proposals for progressive income tax, women's suffrage, an 8-hour workday, and the seizure of church property, a mishmash of nationalist and radical positions that does not cohere into a stable ideology. What it coheres into is a movement held together not by doctrine but by the personality of its leader and the willingness of its members to use violence against the designated enemies. The enemies shift as the political situation requires. The socialists are the primary enemy in 1919 and 1920, because the industrialists and landowners who fund the movement need the socialist organizational infrastructure destroyed. The communists remain the enemy after 1921, when the Socialist Party splits. The liberal political class becomes the enemy as the March on Rome approaches. Each enemy designation is a political calculation made with the same cold pragmatism that Talat Pasha applies to the Armenian question, or that Himmler applies to the question of who belongs to the racial community. The specific content of the ideology is less important than the function the ideology serves: to identify who is inside the movement, who is outside it, and who is against it. What remains constant throughout all the ideological shifts and tactical adjustments is the style. Mussolini's specific contribution to 20th century politics is not the ideology of fascism. The ideology is assembled from existing components of nationalism, social Darwinism, and the anti-Marxist radical tradition. But the performance of it. He is the inventor of the political mass spectacle in its modern form, the rally as theater, the speech as physical event, the leader's body as a symbol to be read and interpreted by crowds who are invited to project their desires and their fears onto it. He builds his public persona with a deliberateness that is, once you know to look for it, visible in every photograph and every filmed speech. The jutting jaw, the head tilted back at the angle that the theatre of Italian opera has established as the pose of masculine authority. The barreled chest, often bare in photographs, despite the man being, in private, notably less impressively built than the images suggest. The gestures, the hands on the hips, the arms raised to receive the crowd's adulation, the sudden pointing that focuses the crowd's energy in a single direction. All of this is practiced. All of this is technique, and the technique works. This is what the retrospective view sometimes loses in its justifiable horror at the outcomes. The technique works on real people who are not stupid, who are not simply passive victims of manipulation, but who genuinely respond to what Mussolini offers because what he offers corresponds to something they actually want. The crowds that fill the Piazza Venezia on the great occasions of the fascist state are not primarily composed of people who have been forced there at gunpoint. They are people who believe, or who want to believe, or who have decided that the available alternatives are worse. This is not an excuse, but it is the truth, and the truth matters for understanding how a man like Mussolini acquires and maintains power. He's also, in private, something that the public persona is designed to conceal. A man of considerable personal insecurity, of physical hypochondria, of the specific anxiety of someone who has always needed to prove himself and has never quite arrived at the point where the proving feels finished. He is obsessive about his public image in ways that suggest a person who is never entirely convinced that the image is secure. He controls the photography of his person with a care that would be excessive even by the standards of the extremely image-conscious political culture of the 20th century. He refuses to be photographed with children because the presence of children implies he is old enough to have children. He refuses to allow any mention of his age in the press. He cultivates the image of physical vitality, the horseback riding, the skiing, the athletics, with a zeal that suggests a man fighting a private battle against the evidence of ordinary human aging. This vanity is connected to the political project in ways that are not incidental. The cult of the douche, the personality cult that the fascist propaganda apparatus builds around Mussolini through the 1920s and 1930s, depends on the image of a man who is not merely a politician, but a type, the embodiment of the national will and the national destiny, the physical incarnation of the historical force that is lifting Italy to greatness. A man who is visibly aging, visibly uncertain, visibly human in the ordinary ways that all humans are human. This man cannot sustain that image. The cult requires the continuous performance of a specific kind of invulnerability, and Mussolini knows it. He performs the invulnerability until he cannot, and then the performance collapses along with everything else. But that is 1943. In 1935, in the year of the Ethiopian campaign, he is at the peak of his power and the peak of his conviction that what he is building is both historically necessary and personally his creation. The empire he is about to build on Ethiopian soil is, in his own understanding of it, the validation of everything. The ideology, the violence, the 13 years of propaganda, the crushing of the left, the Matteotti murder and the chamber confrontation, and all of the subsequent repression. Ethiopia is the proof that Italy is great again. The proof is written in mustard gas. Remember that when you listen to the speeches. There is a photograph of Mussolini at a rally in the early 1930s that tells you something important about the relationship between the man and the performance that no biography can quite capture in words. He is at the podium, and the crowd before him is enormous. Tens of thousands, filling the piazza to the edges and spilling into the surrounding streets. And the photograph catches him in the moment of the raised arm, the gesture that has become his signature, the gesture that the crowd mirrors back to him in the Roman salute that is simultaneously his gift to them and their gift to him. What the photograph shows, if you look at the face rather than the gesture, is a man who is wholly present in the moment of performance in a way that is unusual even among politicians who are skilled performers. He is not going through the motions of a practiced routine. He is fully alive in the moment, energized by the crowd in the way that a specific kind of performer is energized, not drained by the performance but fed by it, replenished by the specific energy that the exchange between a skilled orator and an enormous crowd generates. This quality of presence in the performance is one of the things that distinguishes Mussolini from the other figures in this series. Himmler, sitting at his desk in Berlin, processing the reports of the death camps with the focused attention of a bookkeeper, is the opposite of this. A man who empties himself of presence to process the unprocessable. Talat Pasha, working the telegraph network of the Ottoman state, is similarly hidden behind the administrative apparatus. But Mussolini is always visible, always performing, always in the relationship between himself and the audience that defines both his power and his identity. This creates a specific psychological vulnerability that the other figures do not share. His sense of himself is dependent on the audience's response. He needs the crowd in a way that a more internally organized person does not need external validation. The cheering, the raised arms, the specific electricity of a large crowd unified by a single voice. These are not merely useful political tools for Mussolini. They are, in a psychological sense, necessary. They are the evidence that he is what he has told himself he is, and this dependency, this need for the crowd, is connected to his inability to absorb or process failure in any form. The political man who genuinely learns from his mistakes has a certain detachment from his positions. He can acknowledge that a position was wrong without experiencing the acknowledgement as a threat to his fundamental identity. Mussolini cannot do this. Each challenge to his authority, each failure of policy, each defeat on the battlefield is experienced not as information to be processed, but as an attack on the self that must be denied or externalized. The deepening military disasters of the Second World War, North Africa, Greece, the Russian front, where Italian forces suffer catastrophic casualties that the propaganda system can only partially conceal, produce in Mussolini not the kind of strategic reassessment that a different kind of leader might make, but a doubling down on the rhetoric of destiny, a series of pronouncements about the ultimate victory that becomes progressively more detached from the military reality. The speech he gives at the Adriano Theatre in Rome in December 1942, after the catastrophic Italian defeat at El Alamein and in the midst of the disaster unfolding on the Russian front, is a masterclass in the gap between a political leader and the reality he is supposed to be managing. The performance is technically brilliant. The rhythms are still there, the pauses, the climaxes. The content is a fantasy. The audience, which is no longer composed of ordinary Italians but of party faithful selected for their reliability, performs its approval with the dutifulness of people who have learned that the performance is required, regardless of what anyone actually believes. He is deposed on July 25, 1943, in a coup by his own Grand Council, with the king's participation 3 weeks after the Allied invasion of Sicily. The man who has been governing Italy for 21 years is arrested and taken to a mountain resort in the Abruzzo, where he is held by the Italian military government. He is rescued by German paratroopers in September 1943, installed as the head of the puppet Italian Social Republic in northern Italy, the Salo Republic, and spends the final 18 months of his life in a position that every informed person, including Mussolini himself, understands to be entirely dependent on German military power, and therefore entirely without the quality that his entire public persona has been built on. He no longer has the crowd, he has the Germans. The writing that he produces in this period, the memoirs, the articles, the political reflections, has a quality of desperate revisionism that is different from the triumphalist rhetoric of his peak years. He is trying to explain himself, to position himself in history, to ensure that the account that survives is the account he would choose rather than the account that the evidence supports. He blames his generals. He blames his allies. He blames the king. He blames the ordinary Italians who failed to show the quality of spirit that the historical moment required. He does not blame himself for the decisions that produced the disasters. He does not have the psychological architecture to do this. The man who named himself after Mexican and Italian revolutionaries, who learned his first political lessons in the osteria of Predapio, who discovered at some point in his 20s that he could make a room listen to him and spent the rest of his life making rooms listen to him, this man does not possess the capacity for the kind of self-examination that accountability requires. He dies on the road outside Giulino di Mezzegra, shot by partisan firing squad, and his body is hung upside down from a gas station ceiling in Milan. The crowd that gathers is the last crowd of his life, and it is not the crowd of the Piazza Venezia rallies. It is a crowd that has come to see what has become of the man who told them they were going to be great again. What they see is a body. The performance is over. The invasion of Ethiopia in October 1935 is not a battle between equals in any dimension except one: courage. The Ethiopian army, mobilized by Emperor Haile Selassie in a general call to arms that draws on the traditions of a warrior culture going back centuries, fights with genuine skill and tenacity against an enemy that has overwhelming advantages in every category of industrial military capability. The equipment disparity is total. Italian tanks and aircraft against Ethiopian infantry armed with rifles, some of them bolt-action models from the previous century. Italian artillery against fortified positions built according to the military traditions of the mountain highlands, designed for defense against enemies who fight the same way the defenders do. Italian chemical weapons against an enemy that has no protection against them and no treatment for the injuries they cause. The chemical weapons are the hinge of the war. They are the decision, made in Rome, authorized by Mussolini, implemented by the field commanders after the initial Italian advances are slowed by Ethiopian resistance, that converts what might have been a prolonged conventional war into something more quickly decisive and more completely horrifying. Marshal Pietro Badoglio, who takes command of the Italian forces in November 1935 after the initial commander, General De Bono, is replaced for being too cautious, receives from Rome the authorization to use whatever means are necessary to conclude the campaign. In the period between December 1935 and March 1936, Italian aircraft drop hundreds of tons of mustard gas, phosgene and lewisite on Ethiopian military positions, and, with a lack of distinction that the post-war tribunal will document in detail, on civilian populations, on villages, on the rivers and water sources that the population depends on. and on Red Cross medical units, whose clearly marked tents are bombed by aircraft whose pilots cannot have failed to see the markings. The use of chemical weapons against clearly marked Red Cross facilities is not an accident of war. It is documented in Ethiopian testimony and confirmed by international observers at the time. The Red Cross issues formal protests. The League of Nations receives reports. The British and French foreign offices are informed. The Italian government denies partially, selectively, unconvincingly, and then simply continues. The Ethiopian experience of this campaign is documented partly through the accounts of the survivors who gave testimony after the war, and partly through the reports of the foreign observers, journalists, diplomats, aid workers, medical personnel from the International Red Cross, who were present in Ethiopia during the conflict and who sent reports to their home countries describing what they were witnessing. These reports are remarkably consistent in their core details: aircraft dropping bombs and canisters of gas on positions that include civilians, burns from mustard gas that the local medical system has no means to treat, Ethiopian fighters continuing to advance against Italian positions even after taking significant chemical casualties because they do not understand, initially, what the burns and the blindness mean, and how to protect against them. There is a specific quality to the documentation of the chemical attacks in Ethiopia that distinguishes it from similar documentation in other contexts: the foreignness of the weapon to its victims. Mustard gas was used extensively in the First World War, but the soldiers who faced it in the trenches of the Western Front had some preparation. Gas masks, training, procedures for recognizing and responding to an attack. The Ethiopian fighters and the Ethiopian civilians had none of this. Many of them had no framework within which to understand what was happening to them. Why the sky itself seemed to be burning them, why water from certain streams caused blistering, why wounds that looked minor became infections that could not be treated. Haile Selassie himself describes the chemical attacks in his address to the League of Nations in June 1936, delivered in Amharic through a translator to an assembly that has already effectively conceded the military situation. His testimony is precise and controlled, the testimony of a man who has witnessed something and has decided that bearing witness is what he can still offer when military resistance is no longer possible. He describes the aircraft. He describes the streams of liquid fire that fall from them. He describes the burns. He describes the effects on the civilian population in terms that the assembled delegates of the world's governments hear and record and, for the most part, do nothing about. Haile Selassie's speech to the League of Nations is one of the most significant acts of public testimony in the 20th century, and its reception, the scattered applause, the Italian delegation's attempts to disrupt it, the subsequent failure of the international community to take meaningful action, is itself a document of what the world decides to do with the truth when the truth is inconvenient. The Italian military campaign, assisted by the chemical weapons, achieves its military objectives by May 1936. Addis Ababa falls on May 5, 1936. Mussolini proclaims the Italian Empire from the balcony of the Palazzo Venezia on May 9th, with the king as Emperor of Ethiopia and himself as the architect of the restoration. The crowds in Rome are enormous. The celebrations are genuine. 13 years of telling people that Italy was going to be great again have arrived at a moment that looks, from the Piazza Venezia on May 9th, 1936, like validation. What the occupation of Ethiopia actually produces, in the years that follow, is a prolonged guerrilla resistance that the Italian forces respond to, with measures whose brutality exceeds even the chemical weapons campaign in its intimacy and its systematic quality. The massacre at Debre Libanos in 1937 is the clearest single example of what Italian occupation looks like at the ground level. The monastery of Debre Libanos, near Addis Ababa, is one of the most important sites in Ethiopian Orthodox Christianity, a place of pilgrimage and learning that has been operating in one form or another for 15 centuries. In February 1937, there is an attempt to assassinate Marshal Rodolfo Graziani, the Viceroy of Italian East Africa, in Addis Ababa. Two Eritrean nationalists throw grenades at Graziani during a public ceremony. Graziani survives, wounded. The response to the assassination attempt, authorized from Rome, conducted by Italian military and paramilitary forces over the following days, kills somewhere between 2,000 and 30,000 people in Addis Ababa alone, in 3 days of organized massacre of the city's population. Estimates of the total number vary enormously because the Italian forces are not keeping the kind of records that historians can later examine. Then, in May 1937, Graziani conducts the Debre Libanos massacre. Monks and pilgrims at the monastery are arrested on the grounds that the monastery has provided shelter to the resistance fighters who had conducted earlier attacks. Approximately 450 monks are executed by firing squad, along with an unknown but significant number of pilgrims and deacons who happen to be at the monastery. The abbot is killed. The monastery is desecrated. The decision to execute hundreds of monks at an ancient monastery is not made by a junior officer in the field exceeding his orders. It is made by Graziani, who is acting within a framework of authority that explicitly permits mass reprisals against civilian populations suspected of harboring or supporting resistance fighters. The framework is authorized from Rome. The specific decision about Debre Libanos is Graziani's. The structure within which that decision is possible is Mussolini's. In Libya, which has been an Italian colonial possession since 1911, the parallels are even more direct and are documented with greater archival precision because the Libyan colonial period is longer and the documentation is more extensive. The campaign against the Senussi resistance movement in Libya in the late 1920s and early 1930s, conducted primarily by Marshal Pietro Badoglio and General Rodolfo Graziani, the same men who will later conduct the Ethiopian campaign, involves the construction of concentration camps for the civilian population of Cyrenaica, the region where Senussi influence is strongest, and the forced relocation of the nomadic tribal population into these camps to separate them from the resistance fighters who depend on them for support. The camps are not extermination camps in the specific industrial sense that the Nazi camps will be. They are concentration camps in the original meaning of the term, places where populations are concentrated with inadequate food, inadequate water, inadequate sanitation, and inadequate medical care, under conditions that generate mass mortality through disease and malnutrition. The Cyrenaican camp system, which holds perhaps 100,000 people at its peak, kills somewhere between 40,000 and 70,000 people, a significant proportion of the total Cyrenaican population between 1929 and 1933. In the camps, families are held in conditions that reduce them to the minimum survivable level of existence. Rations calculated at below subsistence level, tents or simple shelters inadequate for the climate, prohibition on movement that makes the usual strategies of nomadic survival, moving to where food and water are available, impossible. The old and the young die first, as they always do in conditions of this kind. The adults who survive often survive with permanent damage to their health, and in communities where health is already marginal and medical care is essentially absent, this damage has multi-generational consequences. The secret police apparatus within Italy itself, the OVRA, the Organization for Vigilance and Repression of Anti-Fascism, established in 1927, is the domestic face of the same system. The OVRA maintains a network of informants throughout Italian society, monitors correspondence, surveils suspected anti-fascists, and provides the investigative and prosecutorial apparatus through which the Special Tribunal for the Defense of the State conducts its work. The Special Tribunal is a political court, not a legal one in any meaningful sense. It tries cases without juries, applies laws that are defined to make virtually any form of political opposition criminal, and sends defendants to prison or internal exile or execution on the basis of standards of evidence that a genuine legal proceeding would not accept. The internal exile system, confino, deserves particular attention because it is one of the more ingeniously cruel features of the fascist repression. Dissidents who are not imprisoned outright are sent to live in remote villages in southern Italy or on islands, Lipari, Ventotene, Ustica, under conditions of enforced idleness, isolation, and surveillance. They are not in a cell. They are in a village, visible, monitored, their daily movements reported to the local police, unable to work in their profession, unable to leave, unable to receive visitors without permission, unable to communicate freely by letter. The confinement is psychological as much as physical. It is designed to break the person through isolation and futility, rather than through direct violence, to produce the demoralization of someone who is not being obviously martyred and who therefore has no dramatic narrative through which to process the experience. Carlo Levi, the writer and physician who was sent to Confino in a Basilicata village in 1935 and who writes about the experience in his post-war memoir, Christ Stopped at Eboli, describes the peculiar quality of this existence, the enforced intimacy with a peasant society that has its own profound relationship to suffering and exclusion, the strange dignity of people who have always been excluded from the promises of the Italian state and who therefore view the arrival of a persecuted intellectual with a kind of recognition that is its own form of community. But Levi's relatively gentle experience of Confino is not the experience of everyone in the system. Political prisoners who are deemed more dangerous, the communists, the serious organizers, the people with international connections and demonstrated commitment to anti-fascist action, face the Special Tribunal and imprisonment at the maximum security prison on the island of Pianosa or in the Asinara prison on Sardinia, or are executed outright. Antonio Gramsci, the communist intellectual, whose prison notebooks will become one of the most significant works of 20th century political philosophy, spends 11 years in the prison system, dying in 1937 at age 46. His health destroyed by the conditions of his confinement. The fascist prosecutor at his trial reportedly says, "We must stop this brain from working for 20 years. They stop it permanently." The OVRA, at its peak, maintains informants who report on approximately 200,000 Italians. In a country of 44 million, that represents a reach into every community, every profession, every family circle large enough to include a dissident. The informant network is not composed primarily of ideological fascists. It is composed primarily of ordinary people who have been given the choice, often implicitly, sometimes explicitly, between reporting and being reported on, between serving the system and being consumed by it. This is how surveillance states maintain their reach, not through the commitment of true believers, but through the rational calculations of people who are trying to survive. The human scale of this in individual lives is enormous and mostly unrecorded. The school teacher who does not report her neighbor and then spends the next 3 years wondering if her neighbor will report her. The journalist who writes what he's allowed to write and tries not to think too carefully about what he is not writing. The priest who gives the sacraments to everyone who presents themselves at his church, including the young men who are going to the Ethiopian front and the young men who have found reasons not to go and who does not ask too many questions about the difference. The ordinary functioning of a surveillance state does not primarily look like secret police dragging people from their beds in the middle of the night. It primarily looks like people making small accommodations, small silences, small compliances, day after day, in a world where the cost of not complying is visible and the benefit of complying is at least the absence of that cost. This is what Mussolini's Italy looks like from the inside. The specific history of chemical weapons used in Ethiopia is documented in detail that the Italian government did not anticipate surviving the war, and the survival of that documentation is one of the more important accidents of the archive of the 20th century. The documentation comes from multiple independent sources. The reports of International Red Cross personnel who were present in Ethiopia during the campaign, the dispatches of foreign journalists who witnessed the aftermath of chemical attacks and sent reports to their home publications, the testimony of Ethiopian survivors and soldiers who gave accounts to the Ethiopian Government Commission established after the liberation, and the German diplomatic cables that document German military advisors' observations during a period when Germany and Italy are nominally in a complex relationship of strategic calculation rather than formal alliance. The picture these sources construct is consistent and damning. Italian aircraft systematically used mustard gas, phosgene and lewisite against Ethiopian military formations and against civilian populations that were near those formations or that were suspected of providing support to them. The Red Cross doctors who treated the wounded documented the chemical burns that are the specific signature of mustard gas exposure. The blistering of skin and mucous membranes, the blindness, the respiratory damage. And their reports are preserved in the International Committee of the Red Cross Archives in Geneva, with the clinical precision of people who understood they were documenting something that had not been previously documented in this kind of conflict. The Ethiopian experience of chemical warfare is, as the Red Cross personnel noted in their reports, uniquely terrible because the population had no defense against it and no understanding of what it was. Soldiers who had shown extraordinary courage against conventional weapons, who had advanced across open ground into machine gun fire with a discipline that the Italian military commanders documented with a respect mixed with their frustration at the resistance, were destroyed by something they could neither fight nor hide from. The gas came from aircraft, which meant it came from above, which meant that the terrain advantage that the Ethiopian Highland fighters had used effectively in the early months of the campaign provided no protection against it. The water contamination aspect of the chemical weapons use is particularly documented because it represents a targeting of the civilian population rather than military formations. Ethiopian settlements in the highland regions depend on specific water sources, springs, streams, river crossings that are fixed and known and around which community life is organized. Italian aircraft dropping gas canisters on these water sources were not targeting military assets. They were targeting the population's ability to survive in their own landscape. The symptoms that Ethiopian civilians brought to whatever medical facilities existed, the same chemical burns that the Red Cross personnel were documenting on soldiers, tell you what was being targeted. The bombing of Red Cross facilities is separately documented and separately damning. The Geneva Conventions of 1929, which Italy had signed, explicitly protected medical facilities marked with the Red Cross emblem from deliberate attack. Ethiopian Red Cross units, marked with the regulation symbols, were bombed multiple times during the campaign. The ICRC issued formal protests. The Italian government responded with the claim that the markings had not been visible, or that the facilities had been located near military positions, or that the pilots had not been given orders to bomb them specifically. The responses were not credible and were not intended to be credible. They were diplomatic cover for a policy decision. The policy decision, to use chemical weapons, to bomb medical facilities, to treat the Ethiopian civilian population as a legitimate target in the management of resistance, is made at the command level. Pietro Badoglio, who succeeds De Bono as field commander in November 1935, requests and receives authorization from Rome for the use of chemical weapons. In a telegram that historians have examined in the archives of the Italian military, the authorization is granted. The weapons are used. Badoglio is promoted to Marshal of Italy after the campaign's successful conclusion. He later becomes, after the July 1943 coup that removes Mussolini, the head of the Italian government that negotiates the armistice with the Allies and then collaborates with them against Germany. The man who authorized the chemical weapons campaign in Ethiopia becomes, within a decade, a participant in the Allied war against fascism. His war crimes in Ethiopia are never prosecuted. He dies in 1956, a Marshal of Italy to the end. Graziani, who conducts the Debre Libanos massacre and the reprisals in Addis Ababa in 1937, is more seriously prosecuted but, as noted, barely punished. The contrast between the brevity of his imprisonment and the scale of what he authorized is a measure of what international accountability actually looked like for colonial crimes in the post-war period. A formal legal process that acknowledges the crime and then declines to match the punishment to the scale of the acknowledgement. The domestic repression apparatus in Italy deserves attention that it often does not receive, partly because it is less dramatically visible than the colonial violence, and partly because its primary victims are Italian citizens rather than colonized people, which means the victims are better documented and their stories better integrated into the national historical narrative. The numbers of Italians processed through the OVRA surveillance system, the Special Tribunal, the Confino Network, and the OVRA prisons are substantial. In the course of the fascist period, approximately 10,000 Italians are imprisoned for political reasons. 15,000 or more are sent to Confino, and a smaller but significant number are executed or die in custody. These are not, by the standards of the Nazi death camps, enormous numbers. They are, by the standards of a country that considers itself a democracy and that has a formal legal system and that describes itself as bringing civilization to others, an account of what the state can do to the people it governs when the constraints on state violence are removed. The OVRA's specific method of operation, the cultivation of informants within every community, the maintenance of files on millions of citizens, the intersection of the surveillance apparatus with the official judicial system, is worth examining as a model because it is a model that will be applied in more or less elaborated forms in every authoritarian state that follows. The fascist OVRA is not the most comprehensive surveillance apparatus of the 20th century. The Stasi and the KGB will both exceed it in the density of their coverage. But it is one of the earliest fully developed examples of a modern authoritarian state's approach to political control through mass surveillance combined with selective prosecution. The selectivity is part of the design. The OVRA does not arrest everyone it has files on. It arrests enough people, visibly and publicly enough, to establish that arrest is possible, that the surveillance is real, that the dossier being maintained in some office somewhere is not a bureaucratic fiction, but a genuine threat. The function of the surveillance state is not primarily to punish the dissidents it catches. It is to convince the much larger population of potential dissidents that the cost of dissent is too high, that the file exists, that the arrest is possible, and that the life one is currently living, constrained, complicit, shaped by the boundaries of permitted thought, is preferable to the alternative. This calculation is made by millions of Italians every year between 1927 and 1943, and the cumulative effect of those calculations is the ordinary functioning of the fascist state. Not a country of passionate believers in every corner, but a country of people who have decided individually and repeatedly that the path of compliance is better than the path of resistance. The people who choose resistance anyway, the communists who maintain their underground networks despite years of OVRA pressure, the liberals who find ways to continue anti-fascist work in exile, the ordinary people who sheltered Jewish families in 1943 and 1944 at genuine personal risk, are the exception that proves the rule. The rule is accommodation, the exception is courage. Both are real. Both tell you something about the texture of life under a fascist state that the aggregate statistics cannot capture. Hirut survives. This is not the outcome the system was designed to produce, but it is the outcome that individual survival always stubbornly produces in the face of systems that would prefer it otherwise. She survives the occupation of her village, survives the years of Italian colonial administration, survives the transition that follows when the British forces, fighting the Axis in East Africa, defeat the Italian forces in 1941 and restore Haile Selassie to his throne. She survives into a country that is trying to reconstruct itself from the specific kind of damage that comes not from natural disaster, but from the deliberate action of another people's government. What the Italian occupation leaves behind in Ethiopia is a set of problems that compound over generations in the way that a colonial violence always compounds. The loss of the educated class who died or were imprisoned or fled. The disruption of the land tenure systems that the occupation reorganized according to Italian colonial priorities rather than Ethiopian ones. The specific damage to the communities that were targeted for collective punishment during the resistance period. The psychological inheritance of occupation that passes through families and communities in the forms of testimony and silence, and the particular mix of pride and grief that is the survivor's emotional landscape. The Ethiopian government of Haile Selassie, restored in 1941, attempts to document the crimes of the Italian occupation with a systematicity that reflects the understanding that documentation is itself a form of resistance to erasure. The commission that Haile Selassie establishes to record the atrocities of the occupation period produces a body of testimony and documentary evidence that becomes one of the foundations for the post-war international accountability discussions, contributing to the legal framework within which war crimes trials are conducted, and genocide is eventually defined as a concept in international law. The specific crime of the Debre Libanos massacre is documented, prosecuted, and then, in the way that most colonial crimes are prosecuted, incompletely resolved. Graziani, who authorized the massacre, is captured by Allied forces after the Italian surrender, tried by an Italian military tribunal in 1948, convicted and sentenced to 19 years imprisonment. He serves less than 2 years before being released. He subsequently becomes active in Italian neo-fascist politics, helps found a political party, writes his memoirs without apparent regret, and dies in his bed in Rome in 1955 at the age of 72. He is, by the standards of post-war colonial accountability, a relatively harshly punished figure. Most of the Italian officers and officials who administered the concentration camps in Libya, who supervised the forced relocations of the Ethiopian civilian population, who executed suspected resistance supporters in reprisals. Most of them returned to Italy in 1943 and resumed their lives. The Italian post-war reckoning with fascism and colonial violence has a specific, historically distinctive shape. The dominant Italian post-war narrative, the myth in the sense of a foundational story, not in the sense of a falsehood, is the narrative of the resistance, the partisan movement that fought the German occupation and the Italian Social Republic of 1943 to 1945, which is real and which involved real courage and real sacrifice by real people, but which serves, in the national memory, a function that is partly about what it is and partly about what it displaces. The resistance narrative allows post-fascist Italy to understand itself primarily as a country that was occupied by fascism and that rose against it, rather than as a country that generated fascism, that provided the institutional and social base for 21 years of fascist rule, that cheered in the Piazza Venezia when Mussolini proclaimed the empire, and that did not, in any large-scale organized way, resist the deportation of Italian Jews to the Nazi camps when that deportation began in 1943. The resistance is real. The other narrative, the narrative of complicity and collaboration and the ordinary support that ordinary people gave to a fascist state, is also real, and it is the narrative that the resistance myth, consciously or not, tends to obscure. The colonial crimes are more thoroughly suppressed in Italian national memory than even the domestic crimes of the fascist period. For decades after the war, the Italian colonial experience in Ethiopia, Libya, Eritrea, and Somalia is remembered in Italy primarily through the lens of the Italian colonists and administrators who lived there. The roads and buildings that were constructed, the genuine modernization projects that were undertaken alongside the violence, the image of Italians as brava gente, good people, colonizers whose methods were gentler than the Belgian or German or British models, and who left behind, in the countries they colonized, a legacy of at least mixed rather than purely negative experience. This brava gente myth is one of the most durable and most consequential pieces of national self-deception in modern European history. It has allowed Italy to avoid the kind of sustained national reckoning with colonial violence that other European countries, Germany, Belgium, France, the Netherlands, have conducted, however imperfectly, since the late 20th century. The argument that Italian colonialism was somehow less bad, that the Italians were somehow kinder, is refuted by the concentration camps in Libya, by the chemical weapons in Ethiopia, by the Debri Libanos massacre, by the documented accounts of Italian colonial violence that Ethiopian, Libyan, Eritrean, and Somali historians and communities have been producing and preserving for decades. The argument persists anyway, because the persistence of myths of national exceptionalism does not depend primarily on their factual accuracy. It depends on the psychological and political needs they serve. The Ethiopian community's memory of the Italian invasion and occupation operates on a different register entirely. The date of October 3rd, 1935, the beginning of the invasion, is marked in Ethiopia. The monuments to the resistance fighters, the oral histories that families and communities have maintained since the generation of the occupation itself, the specific cultural memory of what was done at Debri Libanos and in the cities and on the roads of the country. This memory does not require an official national narrative to sustain it, because it is sustained by the people who lived it and their descendants, by the specific named losses that each family carries. by the presence of the destruction still visible in communities that are still reconstructing. The international accountability framework that the Ethiopian case helped build. The Geneva Convention's specific prohibitions on the use of chemical weapons against civilian populations, the development of the concept of crimes against humanity that the Nuremberg tribunals will later apply to the Nazi case, and that Haile Selassie's testimony to the League of Nations had already articulated, is one of the more important legacies of the Italian invasion in the history of international law. It is also one of the least celebrated. The Ethiopian case is the precedent that the more prominent cases depend on, and the precedent is consistently less familiar than the cases it precedes. Mussolini's personal end is well known, partly because it is dramatic and partly because the drama has the quality of a specific kind of political mythology. The tyrant brought low, the deuce reduced to a fugitive. The man who stood on the balcony of the Palazzo Venezia and told the crowds that Italy was great again found hiding in a German truck column near Lake Como on April the 25th, 1945, attempting to escape to Switzerland. He is recognized by partisans at a roadblock. He is arrested and held overnight and then shot the following day, April 28th, 1945, along with his mistress Clara Petacci and several other fascist officials, by partisan firing squad on the road outside the village of Giulino di Mezzegre. Their bodies are taken to Milan and hung upside down from the roof of a gas station on the Piazzale Loreto, the same piazzale where, in August 1944, 15 partisans had been executed by fascist authorities and their bodies left on public display. The crowd that gathers at the Piazzale Loreto on April the 29th, 1945 to view the bodies of Mussolini, Petacci, and the other dead fascists is the crowd of a city that has been liberated, and the emotions on display are the complicated emotions of liberation after years of occupation. Relief, rage, the specific energy of a population that has been performing deference to power for years and is suddenly permitted to show what it actually feels. The crowd is not sympathetic to the man hanging upside down from the gas station ceiling. The crowd is making clear, through the acts that crowds perform when the structures of authority have collapsed, that what was done in their name was done without their genuine consent. This is partially true and partially a myth as well. Some of it was done without genuine consent, under the coercion that the OVRA and the Squadrismo and the Special Tribunal maintained. Some of it was done with the genuine enthusiasm of people who believed the story they were being told and wanted to believe it, and have only now, with the outcome clear, decided they never believed it at all. The honest accounting of how much of the fascist project was coerced and how much was genuinely popular is the accounting that Italian national memory has been conducting with varying levels of candor for 80 years, and that remains, in specific respects, unfinished. The neo-fascist political parties that form in Italy in the years immediately after the war, drawing on the institutional networks and the personnel of the fascist state, persist in Italian politics in various forms through the post-war decades. The Movimento Sociale Italiano, founded partly by Graziani, is the clearest lineage. Successive transformations and renamings and ideological adjustments carry elements of this tradition through Italian politics to the present day, through the Alleanza Nazionale and into the contemporary right, where the legacy of fascism is a contested and politically charged presence rather than a cleanly resolved historical episode. This is not uniquely Italian. The persistence of fascist-adjacent politics in post-war European countries that generated fascism is a general phenomenon, and it reflects the general truth that the defeat of a fascist state does not resolve the social and psychological conditions that made fascism possible. The economic insecurities, the national resentments, the longing for the kind of clear and forceful leadership that the parliamentary confusion seems unable to provide, these do not disappear with the defeat. They are managed, more or less effectively, by the post-war institutional arrangements, and they re-emerge, more or less strongly, depending on how well the institutions manage them at any given historical moment. Hirut is old in the world of this story. She is old in the way that a person who has survived something that was designed to kill them is old, with a specific kind of knowledge that cannot be communicated directly, but that can be transmitted in the telling, in the particular quality of the testimony that says, "I was there, and I'm still here. And the account I give you is the account of what I saw, not the account of what I was told to see." Her village was occupied. Her family was broken by it. The specific compound where she stood in the doorway on October 3rd, 1935, and watched the soldiers enter. That compound existed, even if no photograph of it survived, even if no document recorded the name of the officer who ordered the search, even if the man who stood in her doorway returned to Italy in 1943 and lived the rest of his life in Palermo or Genova or Torino, without ever being asked to account for what his presence in that doorway meant. The empire that Mussolini built on the suffering of people in her village and 1,000 other villages was an empire built on a lie. Not just the lie of the propaganda, the invented glory, and the racial hierarchy and the civilizing mission, but the more fundamental lie that the people of Ethiopia and Libya and Eritrea were not fully people in the sense that their suffering needed to be accounted for. The empire was built on the calculation that they did not matter enough to stop the gas and the bombs and the firing squads. The calculation was wrong. They matter. The evidence is the survival of the testimony. The girl who stood in the doorway in 1935 is the evidence. She is still here. Remember her name, Hirut. She was 17 years old when the soldiers came. The man who sent them was smiling in Rome. He died upside down from a gas station ceiling with the crowd that once cheered him standing below. The empire he built on her suffering lasted less than a decade. Her survival lasted a lifetime. The question of how Italy reckons with the fascist period is not a question that was asked once and answered. It is a question that has been asked continuously since 1943. And that produces different answers at different moments depending on the political context, the generational composition of the population doing the asking, and the specific aspect of the fascist legacy being examined. The Nuremberg model, formal legal prosecution of the leadership of a defeated regime conducted by an international tribunal with documentary evidence and testimony from survivors, is the model that defines the primary post-war accountability framework for German fascism. Italy does not receive anything equivalent. The Italian case is handled by the Italian state itself through a combination of the 1946 amnesty decree that covers most of the crimes committed during the fascist period, a series of inadequate military tribunal proceedings for the most egregious colonial and war crimes, and the general social settlement that allows most of the fascist state's personnel to continue their careers in the post-war republic. The amnesty of 1946, championed by Palmiro Togliatti as Minister of Justice in the spirit of national reconciliation, is one of the most contested decisions in post-war Italian history. Its justification that prosecuting the mass of fascist collaborators and minor officials would make the reconstruction of the state impossible, since the state's remaining institutional capacity depends on the people who operated it, has a real practical basis. Its consequence is the retention in the post-war Republican state of a large number of people whose understanding of how power should be exercised was formed in the fascist period and who bring that understanding into the new institutions. This retention is visible in the judiciary, in the military, in the intelligence services, in the educational system. The continuities are not total. There is genuine change, genuine introduction of new personnel with different formation, genuine institutional reform. But they are real, and they explain why the post-war Italian state's relationship to its fascist past is more equivocal than Germany's, and why that equivocation has political consequences that are still visible in the 21st century. The Italian colonial past is even less fully reckoned with than the domestic fascist period. The reason is structural as well as psychological. Italy's formal decolonization, unlike France's, does not involve the kind of prolonged and violent colonial wars whose conduct is impossible to entirely suppress in national memory. Italy loses its colonies in 1943 as a consequence of military defeat, rather than through independence movements that produce a long public debate about the justice of the colonial enterprise. The loss is quick, externally imposed, and can be processed primarily as a military defeat rather than as a moral reckoning. The countries that were colonized do not have the option of processing it this way. Libya, Ethiopia, Eritrea, Somalia. These countries carry the specific legacy of the Italian colonial period in the fabric of their institutional development, in the disrupted land tenure systems, in the demographic consequences of the concentration camps and the massacres, in the infrastructure that was built for colonial rather than indigenous purposes, and that continues to shape the physical landscape in ways that are not always to the advantage of the populations that live there. The question of whether Italy owes reparations to the countries it colonized has been raised periodically without producing a comprehensive settlement. Italy has provided development aid to Ethiopia and to Libya under various bilateral agreements. There have been official apologies for specific acts. The Italian government apologizes for the colonial occupation of Libya in 2008, signing an agreement with Gaddafi that includes a significant financial payment and acknowledgement of historical wrongs. The acknowledgement of the Ethiopian colonial period has been less formal, and the acknowledgement of the specific crimes, the chemical weapons, the Debris Libanos massacre, the systematic treatment of the civilian population, has been less comprehensive than the scale of those crimes would seem to require. There is a specific Ethiopian demand, periodically raised and never fully answered, for the return of the Axum obelisk, one of the great monumental stones of the ancient Aksumite Empire, taken from Ethiopia by Italian forces in 1937 as a trophy of conquest and erected in Rome near the offices of the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization. Italy agrees in 1947, under the terms of the post-war peace treaty, to return the obelisk. It returns to Ethiopia in 2008, 7 decades later, after decades of Italian delay and diplomatic excuse-making. The physical return of the stone is completed. The broader question of what the stone's removal represented and what its return means in terms of the relationship between the two countries is a question that outlasts the logistics of the transportation. The Ethiopian memory of the Italian invasion and occupation is, in its own tradition, vivid and specific in ways that the Italian national memory is not. There are Ethiopian families whose history is organized around the occupation period the way other families' histories are organized around a war or a displacement, as the central catastrophic event that divides before from after and that shapes everything that follows. The specific losses, the father who was killed in a reprisal, the brother who died in a forced labor project, the land that was taken and never fully returned, are not abstract historical facts, but living family realities, maintained in the way that important things are maintained in oral cultures, through telling, through commemoration, through the insistence that the next generation know what happened to the generation before. The Italians who settled in East Africa during the colonial period, and whose descendants sometimes maintain connections to the countries where their families lived, are a specific community navigating a complex legacy. The connection to places where genuine lives were built, sometimes with genuine affection for the people and landscapes of those places, and the awareness of the political and moral context within which those lives were possible. This is not a unique situation. It describes every settler colonial community to varying degrees. But it is one that the Italian case has addressed less directly than some others, and the failure to address it is itself a form of historical choice. The Piazzale Loreto, where Mussolini's body was hung on April 29, 1945, is today a busy traffic interchange in the north of Milan, traversed daily by thousands of people who are going to work, or to the market, or to school, or wherever else the ordinary business of city life takes them. There is no major memorial at the site. There is a small plaque. The gas station is gone. The building that witnessed the crowd is gone. The city has grown around the historical moment, the way cities always grow around historical moments, incorporating them into the fabric of the present until the present is so thick over them that the past requires deliberate excavation to find. The excavation is, in this case, still happening. The centenary of the March on Rome in 2022 produced in Italy a specific political debate about the legacy of fascism that was colored by the fact that the Italian national government at that moment was led by a party, the Brothers of Italy, whose institutional lineage runs through the Movimento Sociale Italiano, and therefore through the post-fascist tradition. The political debates about how to commemorate, or whether to commemorate, or what it means to commemorate. These debates are not purely academic. They are arguments about what the past means for the present, about which version of Italian identity is the authoritative one, about whether the fascist period is a closed historical chapter or an ongoing political presence. The argument has no clean resolution. The fascist period is both a closed historical chapter. Hitler is dead, Mussolini is dead, the specific political formations of the 1930s no longer exist, and an ongoing political presence in the form of the political movements and the institutional continuities and the cultural attitudes that carry elements of the fascist tradition into the contemporary world. Hirut is the counter-argument to all of this. Not because her survival cancels out the violence, or because her testimony resolves the historical argument, but because she is specific and concrete in a way that abstractions about political legacy are not, and because the specificity of what happened to her and the people around her is the evidence that the abstractions need to be tested against. An empire was built on her suffering, and it lasted 8 years before the military defeat that ended it. The man who built it died upside down from a gas station ceiling in Milan. The propaganda that sustained it was so thoroughly dismantled by reality that the final years of the regime are marked by the spectacle of people performing enthusiasm for a story nobody believes anymore. But the destruction of the propaganda did not undo the destruction of the villages. The death of the Duce did not return the lives that his soldiers took. The end of the empire did not restore what the empire took. This is always the accounting that the legacy of political violence requires, not just the end of the violence, but the specific, ongoing, multi-generational human cost of what the violence produced. Hirut carries that cost. Her children carry it. The communities that rebuilt around the specific absences the occupation created carry it. The cost does not expire with the perpetrator. It persists in the lives of the people who survived him, and in the lives of the people who survived them, and in the lives that follow from those lives all the way to the present. Remember the name. Hirut, 17 years old. Standing in a doorway in the Tigray highlands on the 3rd of October, 1935, listening to the sound of engines coming up the valley road. The empire was in those engines. So was its end. She is still standing. There is a particular silence that settles over the places where empire happened and then ended. It is not the silence of forgiveness or of resolution. It is the silence of the archive, the particular quiet of rooms where the documents are stored, where the testimonies are filed, where the evidence of what was done waits for whoever is willing to enter and look at it. The Italian archives of the colonial period are accessible to researchers. The documents are there. The telegrams authorizing chemical weapons use are there. The correspondence between Badoglio and Rome is there. The internal reports from the Libyan concentration camp system are there, with their columns of numbers that represent human lives reduced to the ledger entries that administrative murder requires. The silence around those archives is not the silence of absence. It is the silence of a national culture that has not yet fully decided what to do with what the documents say. This is not unique to Italy, but Italy's specific situation, the early fascism, the colonial crimes, the incomplete post-war reckoning, makes the question particularly visible for anyone who is willing to look. The looking is the work. The testimony of one 17-year-old girl standing in a doorway in the Tigray highlands in 1935 is not sufficient to contain the full account of what Italian fascism did in Ethiopia and Libya and inside Italy itself. But it is sufficient as a starting point, sufficient as a reminder that the account is owed. Sufficient as an insistence that the story told by the man on the balcony in Rome is not the only story, and not the true one, and not the one that history ultimately keeps. History keeps Hirut's story. History keeps the testimony of the monks of Debre Libanos and the prisoners of the Libyan camps and the Italian dissidents in the Confino villages, and the families of the men and women processed through the special tribunal. History keeps all of it. The silence around the archives is not permanent. It is a decision, and decisions can be changed. The engines came up the valley road. The soldiers entered the compound. The empire was built, and then the empire fell. And the man who built it died on a road in the rain, and Hirut was still standing. She is still standing.